All right, you already know the basics. You know what class you're in. You may or may not know that I'm Mr. Vote. Mr. Vote or Mr. V is fine. Obviously, the office doesn't matter because we're at home during the plague times. Make sure you're aware of the email address because that's the main way you're going to be in touch with me through the semester, contacting me about grade information, getting help on essays. Most of that will get conducted through the email. Office hours don't matter that much because I'm probably going to be at my computer 6 to 8 hours a day hacking through those emails with a machete, but you can be guaranteed to find me at that terminal from 11 to 1 p.m. I'm going to skip course description and general course description because that's SUNY's official description of the course. It basically is right, but you can read through it on your own. And I'm going to skip to this section here. This is me explaining what I'm really trying for in this class. And really, it's a class in textual analysis. So from William Faulkner, the great Southern American writer, to Geico commercials and the guy in khakis, to Shakespeare and the text that your crush ambiguously texts you at 2 o'clock in the morning and you're not sure if you're in the friend zone, all of those would count as texts, and all of those are things that can be analyzed for a deeper meaning. For me, that's really what the most important aspect of the course is. Skipping down to textbooks, let's have a moment of silent appreciation for the fact that there are no textbooks for this class. I chose to do that for a couple reasons. One is I feel like book publishers and book reps are almost as evil and as insidious as drug and pharmacy representatives. Very exploitive, incredibly expensive, and oftentimes unnecessary. I can see why you'd need an $180 textbook for something like anatomy and physiology, where it actually has to be up to date and you're paying for the most recent research. But most of what we're going to be reading in this class is either going to be available open source or for free online. So I'll be providing all of the readings for the class. All you have to do is maintain enough of an internet connection so you can access the sources that I provide for you. I'm also going to skip through SUNY General Education course outcomes because it's not that they're not important, it's just that those are the reasons that SUNY feels that this class is not only important, but something that will count as a legitimate 3-credit class that you can transfer to other schools in the SUNY system. And I'm going to skip down to students with disabilities. You've probably self-identified. If you know you're somebody who needs extra accommodations made, we're here to help you meet those accommodations and make the class go as smoothly for you as possible. The contact information is new, and I think some teachers haven't updated it, so there could be some incorrect room numbers and incorrect phone numbers, so just double check. I made sure that these are the most up-to-date contact points if you're interested in seeing if you're someone who might need some extra accommodations made to make the class go well for you. All right, the obsessive compulsive in me had to reorganize the page so I could get all of the grading section on one screen. For most of you, this is the most important section in the entire syllabus. It tells you where your grade actually comes from and how I'm calculating that grade. So a couple things to try to highlight here. The first thing I'd point out is that if you combine the vocab quizzes with the reader responses that I'm calling felt difficulties and the grab bag assignments, that gets you a pretty beefy 30% of the grade. And I would say any one of those shorter assignments, including the quizzes, are not that difficult. So think of that as some cushioning. If you're a little anxious about the actual essays themselves, you've got 30% of your grade that's largely based on consistency. You're experimenting, coming at ideas from multiple directions, and you're just handing things in on a regular basis. That can give you a really nice cushion in case one of the essays doesn't go well for you. So keep that in mind. If you hand in your homework, you do well on the 3 vocab concept quizzes, 10 questions of multiple choice each, that can really give you some extra leeway and a little flexibility in case the essays don't go spectacularly well for you. I'm going to go over the essays individually as they come up. You'll get directions in advance. You can probably guess the overall feel of the essay from the description here. And that gets you another 60% of your grade. That means remaining 10% is participation. I have to put quotes around in-class participation because we are not in class, and we're doing all of this online. So for most of you, the instructor check-ins is the best way to fulfill the class participation. And depending on your grade contract, whether you contract for a C, a B, or an A, that will change the number of check-ins you have to do. But essentially, all that's going to look like is you email me an idea for an essay, or maybe a few ideas, and you ask my opinion on the topics. You hand me part of an essay in progress and say, how am I doing? Am I going the right direction? And most importantly, if you're shooting for the A, you really should show me an entire draft or two or more before the actual deadline. So in other words, the check-ins are you trying to figure out how the essay is going before the actual due date. So that's the most common way to fulfill the instructor check-ins. You can also take advantage of these campfire Q&A, I'm going to call them. Once a week, I'm going to try to do a live stream. That went pretty horribly wrong last semester, but hopefully I've beefed up my internet connection and technology. Those are completely optional, but if you go to them, you will get check-in points that will count towards your in-class participation. And so if it feels right, for instance, this Thursday at 6 o'clock, we're going to have our first campfire Q&A session. You show up on WebEx. You don't even have to have your video on, but you type in one or two questions. You hear me respond to those questions in real time. You get a sense of where we're going with the class. That also could count towards your participation grade. All right, on to online class policies. Don't worry too much about the formatting. Anytime there's a new essay, you're going to get a full set of directions no less than 2 weeks in advance of the essay due date. And you'll know about things like how to format the heading, how to arrange the margins, font size, all of those kinds of details. So don't worry too much about this section. You'll get more detailed instructions about formatting with the actual first essay directions. Late assignments are bad, so try not to hand in things late. Pretty standard. I'm going to do 1/2 a grade or 5 points off for every 24-hour cycle. So if you hand in a paper, it's got a B plus as is, but you hand it in 1 day late, that would go down to a B. 2 days late goes down to a B minus, etc., until you get to 0. If something comes up and you can't hand in a paper through Blackboard by the deadline, make sure you're in touch with me ahead of time, and we might be able to negotiate depending on the situation. Makeup work, this maybe isn't worded as clearly as it should. Essentially what makeup works mean is you can write a final draft over. You get one redo for the first 2 essays. So 3 essays total, they're all 20% each. Maybe you get a B plus on the first one and the second one's a D minus. You just weren't feeling the assignment. You procrastinated and wrote it in a frenzy 24 hours before it was due. Whatever the reason, one of those 2 papers can have a second chance. Make sure you contact me and I'll let you know what you can do to boost the grade maximally. I'll give you a sense of how you can get as much out of that grade as possible. If you're having trouble, really this is an eat your vegetables moment. You know all of this stuff is true, but at least it has to be said, especially during the coronavirus online adjustment. Make sure you're in touch with us. Make sure you're contacting me as frequently as you can and not falling behind, since a lot of the work in this class is at your own pace. Tempting to let that procrastination, anxiety feedback loop catch up with you. So make sure you try to catch that as soon as you can. Reach out to me and we'll try to get you through with the grade that you're looking for. Moving on to plagiarism. Plagiarism is bad, so you should not do that. Really what I'm worried about here isn't you borrowed some inspiration from a paper that you wrote in high school, or you had your older brother talk you through some interesting ideas and maybe make a suggestion for the ending. Those are a little iffy, but those would not get you kicked out of the class. I'm talking about an entire paper that you stole from papers101.com. I'm acknowledging that I know those sites exist, not to encourage you, but so that you know that they're out there, and the algorithms in Blackboard will find those. So avoid the temptation. Even if you have to throw a paper together that you're just kind of fluffing and meandering through, quite possible that you get a C or a D out of a paper like that, and that keeps you in passing territory. At least full-on plagiarism would get you kicked out of the class and possibly booted from ECC altogether on an academic dishonesty charge. not worth the risk. Make sure you're definitely avoiding the temptation. I think it's going to be more of a temptation online to plagiarize. So just be really, really careful as you weigh your options and think about risk assessment. All right, this isn't a calendar, but it's a general topic outline. So if you want to read through the 3 main units representing the 3 main papers, this gives you more or less a sense of how we're breaking down the semester. Each week, I'm going to try to make sure you know what at least the following week or 2 looks like in terms of dates and where we're at in the class, but this gives you a nice overall arc of where we're going with the course. Okay, that gets us through the bulk of the actual syllabus itself. If we were still having classes in person, I might have tried to kill an entire period going over the syllabus, waiting for questions, answering questions. That might have been a whole 50-minute roundup. But if you've been tuning in and out, or maybe you put this video on and started cooking dinner and you're kind of half paying attention, see if you can kind of come back around, because this is the beginning of actual class content. I want to give you the first official vocab term, which is text. Seems obvious, but I want to make sure I'm explaining to you how we're using that term in this course, since textual analysis and expressing that through writing really is the main point of the entire course. I want to go through it slowly and kind of give you an idea of how we're going to talk about text. So this definition is specific to this class. A point I should make here is that some of the vocab, the key vocab that eventually will show up on quizzes, you'll find the correct definition online. You Google the metacognitive approach to writing, and you get pretty close to the definition that I'm using. Some terms I'm using have definitions that are unique to this class. In other words, I'm using them with a very specific definition, and you'll need to know that definition to succeed on the quiz and ultimately apply those terms on the papers themselves. So this one's a little bit like that. When I talk about text in this class, if you just looked that up on Google right now, eventually you'd find this definition, but let me make it clear that this is the one you'll need for the quiz. Also, speaking of quizzes, I usually try to give 2 levels of a definition. I call it a flashcard definition. That means if you memorize this definition, it would be good enough to get you the correct answer on a multiple choice quiz. But I also want you to have a deeper definition in your notes with some examples, so you don't just have a definition for the term, you also have application. You understand it in context, you can use the term and apply the term. So here it is. The first term of the entire semester is text, and our definition for this class is going to be any man-made form of communication. Let's think about how broad that is, first of all. The only 2 criteria for something to be qualified as a text is it was created by humans, and then it communicates an idea. So that's a pretty big umbrella. Also keep in mind that anything that is a text, if it meets those 2 attributes, made by humans, communicates a concept, that means it can be analyzed and it can be read for deeper meaning. So let me go through some examples and tell you what I'm thinking here. Obviously, books, and include magazines and literature and poetry and all of that. That'll be towards the end of the semester, the final third. We'll talk through that kind of text. You already knew that because they're made up of written textual words, so that seems obvious. Keep text messages in mind also, because sometimes they can be misleading or are deliberately misleading, or if you've ever gotten into a fight over text message, some kind of an instant messaging platform, you know how important it is to read texts accurately for their subtext. It doesn't just have to be the written word though. So I'm going to say movies for sure qualifies as text. That also gets you TV shows, anime, any kind of moving visual media. We'll definitely be talking about that as text. Doesn't have to be narrative, by the way. So a tax form doesn't tell a story or make you feel anything deeply in your soul, but it's a text that has to be read closely. Sometimes tax forms and credit card statements, etc., are deliberately misleading. So sometimes documents like that are texts that need to be read more closely, more intelligently, and more analytically. And of course, anything that qualifies as media. Real news, fake news, anything described as social media, all of that would qualify as a text as well. So, if this course goes well for you, if you really try to take the course seriously and absorb some of the concepts, you'll be better at reading any of these. Any of these would qualify as texts, and you should be a little sharper and a little bit more analytical in your understanding of those. But it's not just those as texts, so keep in mind you can stretch that definition. It only has to meet the two requirements of, is it man-made, and does it communicate an idea? So if this was a quiz question, think to yourself, if the question was, is a painting by Norman Rockwell a text? And well, just say, is it man-made? Sure is. Does it communicate an idea? Sure does. Doesn't need any written words or language involved. It would still be considered a text, and it could be read for deeper meaning. A piece of music, that's going to be our whole first unit, so hopefully that's yes. It's not just lyrics. It can be. The lyrics themselves can be treated as a text, like a poem, where you kind of read for the meaning that the artist was trying to convey through the actual lyrics of the song. But a piece of classical music or some Australian didgeridoo music that has no lyrics, those would also be text. They're man-made. They communicate an idea. Just to take you in a totally different direction, and also to try to justify the course if you're totally not interested in any of these other texts, I could make a case in my mind for if you came upon a dead body, just walking down the street in an alleyway, there's a dead body. If the quiz question was, is that body a text? I think I'd say no. It's sort of man-made in a very literal way, but it's not really created in the same sense. And it's also just a body out of context. Anything it's communicating is, ugh, there's a dead body, that's horrible. As soon as you put that body in context and you say, well, who killed the person, now you're actually looking for narrative. So if you're interested in criminology, you're going to be a forensic psychologist or a crime scene investigator, coming upon a crime scene, that scene is definitely a text because it is man-made and you are deliberately looking for deeper meaning. So if you're a detective trying to solve a murder, you come upon the scene, you're trying to literally read the scene, read between the lines, and use those clues to put together the larger narrative, to figure out what was going on between the lines. So I'm also making the case right now that the same skills that might make you good at reading a sonnet by Shakespeare, that same analytical sense of reading between the lines, also would make you a better forensic investigator or crime scene forensics character. So keep that in mind. It's basically the same analytical part of the brain in play from Shakespeare to a murder scene. A little bit more of a stretch now, but don't forget, a building, like let's take Kittinger, the building that we would be in if we ever get back into buildings in class, is that building itself a text? It's man-made, it communicates an idea as well as serves a function, and you can even do things like what's the difference between a pyramid and a Gothic cathedral? That's called architecture. Architecture is the entire study of reading buildings. So if you think of buildings as text, an architect goes to school to study and learn how to speak the language of buildings. So a building is definitely text as well. And I'd go this far. I would say a brick, well, what is it communicating? It is man-made, so we got one. But what story is it telling? Well, this brick is from ancient Egypt in that pyramid I was talking about. And archaeology is the study of things like old bricks and pottery and the vestiges of our ancestors. So I would even go as far as to say a brick is a text. It's man-made. It communicates an idea. You look at how old it is. You look at the texture. You decide the composition of the rock and what materials were made to make it, and you use that to figure out the context of the brick. So what you're seeing here is a really big umbrella, right? The word text is very inclusive, and ideally, if the course goes well, you're getting better at reading all kinds of texts, from murder scenes to bricks to Shakespeare sonnets. The definition of text is so broad, it's actually kind of hard to come up with a definition or some examples of what is not a text. So I might have to lean on something like, well, you come along, you find a rock in the middle of the woods. That rock by itself, if you don't touch it, is not a text. It may have an idea or a concept. You may say it's smooth and attractive looking, or you might say it's rough and has jagged edges. So it has qualities, but it's not man-made, and whatever ideas it conveys come from you. That's kind of your reaction to the rock. So a rock by itself, not a text. An atom of oxygen or anything along those lines, I think it's atom, or is it a compound? Chemistry majors can leave nasty comments if you need to. But whatever oxygen is, molecule or otherwise, it's so small you don't really notice it until you don't have it. It's not man-made, and really your only relationship to it is that you breathe it and it keeps you alive. But it's not something that needs to be interpreted or kind of turned around and looked at for deeper meaning. So I'd feel comfortable saying an atom of oxygen is not a text. And of course, plants, animals, trees, anything from the natural world by themselves, I would argue, is not text. You could say it's beautiful, it's aesthetic, it's pleasurable to be in an environment of big, luscious trees and attractive plants, but since they weren't put there deliberately by humans, I would argue plants are not texts. I wanted to end with that example, though, because as soon as you pick a plant, you pull it out of the dirt, put it in a little sack, and then you pot it in your house, now it's a text because you've recontextualized it. So for instance, if you walked into somebody's garden and you notice where they put the vegetable patch and where they put the roses and there's a little path that goes through, that 100% is a text. That is called horticulture. Gardening by its very nature is the act of creating aesthetics and creating a little sense of narrative using plants. So anything from house plants to a garden to a farm, which is the most deliberate attempt, agriculture, all of those would be text because they are man-made and they could communicate an idea. So again, text, very wide definition, and I want you to just kind of practice knowing that's the water that we swim in. You're in text all the time. You're navigating texts online, in person, in your own head. A series of textual narratives is going on all the time. This course is really just trying to step back and look at the fact that that's happening and get more analytical and objective in how you analyze texts. Okay, coming in on the home stretch here, I wanted to end with an actual case study just to kind of demonstrate what we're going to be doing with the word text and how it's an essential part of the course. And I'm going to use myself as a guinea pig. This here is an artifact. This is what I used to have in my syllabus in terms of trying to enforce smartphone engagement in classrooms, and I wanted to use it as an example of a text. We know it's a text because it's man-made and it communicates an idea, but it has two layers of meaning. It's got overt text, what it actually says. If you're caught using cell phones or smartphones in class, you're going to be docked points. So that's its overt message. That's what it's saying on the surface. But you can use textual analysis to read between the lines. So I would describe this as an artifact from an old syllabus of mine that you could probably use to learn something beyond the overt text. For instance, the fact that it says cell phones, pagers, and iPods. So that would be a clue. You could say the text has a clue built into it that tells you a little bit about how old the text is. And this clue in particular tells you I've been teaching long enough that originally I had to deal with pagers as a problem in class. If you don't know what pagers are, that's adorable, and you should look it up online and see what happens when you have a little brick on your belt. Somebody calls the brick on your belt, you use the brick to find the number, and you go to a payphone to call the person back. So in other words, we can use clues to look at the age of this text. I'm not going to read through it word for word. If I'm already sick of the sound of my own voice, I can't even imagine how you feel. But let's go a little bit further into some specifics here. For instance, the sentence, even though I'm intrigued by the phenomenon of texting, which leads some to something resembling a compulsion to write in a writing class, texting will not be tolerated. I would describe that as demonstrating the tone. You hear a little bit of passive aggressiveness in the first half of the sentence. You see the bold letters there trying to assert some authority and a sense of strength. And so that sounds like somebody who might be trying a little too hard. So we know it's old. It sounds like somebody who's trying to sound scary. And those might lead you to the correct conclusion that I wrote this when I was 22, the first time I ever taught in class. So we're already learning. We're trying to read between the lines, trying to figure out what's going on in this text beneath the surface. The word don't is in bold, so again, that tells me somebody is trying a little too hard to assert themselves. And then, of course, it ends with a threat. The threat is deliberately designed so that the student doesn't know if they've been cited. And if you can intuit what that means is, if I'm not keeping track, I'm deliberately keeping it vague from the student's perspective as to whether or not they've been cited using their smartphones. You can probably guess how well this policy worked, by the way. Pretty much not at all. We'll come back to smartphones. I do want to talk more about screen time and whether or not we all, as a generation or two, might be addicted to our smartphones, but that's for another day. So what did we learn? We took a text, we looked at its overt meaning, right, what it's directly saying on purpose, but then we tried to look for clues, and we found out it's probably dated based on some of the context clues that are in the text itself. We got a sense of tone, and it's kind of almost overcompensating, that passive-aggressive sense of urgency, borderline hostile. Sounds like somebody who might be trying a little too hard. There is a little sense of irony when he mentions that this is a writing class and some of you are addicted to writing. So a little backspin, a little sarcasm. And of course, at the end, the strategy based on its passive-aggressive nature is ultimately unsuccessful. So we can learn these things by trying to get into the text, looking at what it's saying on purpose, but also noting what it's saying between the lines. Okay, guys, that gets us to the end of the first mini lesson of the semester. Got to talk about the syllabus, a little bit behind the scenes, what I consider most important in terms of your grade in this class. Got to talk about the key vocab concept of text, and then we looked at example of textual analysis in terms of a specific case study. And that's really what the semester is all about, looking at different kinds of text, trying to see what they're saying on the surface, and then turning them around, looking at them from different angles, and trying to have some intelligent things to say that might demonstrate you're reading between the lines, you're going past the surface, and you're getting into a text in a deeper, more meaningful way. As always, email me if you got any questions. Otherwise, I'm out for today, signing off. Take care, guys.